Millions of workers will see bigger paychecks starting on January 1st. That's because the minimum wage is set to increase in 19 states, as well as 49 cities and counties. That's according to the National Employment Law Project. Later in the year, 4 additional states will also raise their base pay. As the federal minimum wage, meanwhile, remains stuck at $7.25 an hour, unchanged since 2009, individual states and municipalities are stepping in. They have raised minimum wages through ballot measures, through legislation, and in some cases automatically by adjusting wages to match inflation. Joining me now with more on all of this is Professor Ellora Derenoncourt. She's an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University. Thanks for being here, Professor. And next month, 12 states will reach a minimum wage of $15 an hour. 3 states and 40 localities will hit $17 per hour, including New York, New Jersey, and California. Should we understand this as a nationwide shift toward higher wages?
Yes, certainly. Wages have been increasing basically since the recovery from the pandemic. And it makes sense that the minimums are also increasing across the states to keep pace with this.
Many Americans, especially in the South, are earning the old federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Can you put that in perspective? I mean, if inflation is moving at around 3% these days, staying at $7.25 amounts to a loss of purchasing power. Families are not just stalling out, but really falling behind at that wage, right?
That's right. The real value of the minimum wage has been declining. The federal minimum wage has been declining basically since the late 1960s. If you look in today's dollars, the highest minimum wage that we've had in the US was in around 1968 and would be closer to something like $15 an hour today.
You know, I see from your writing that the federal minimum wage is not just about economics, but also a civil rights issue. You mentioned the 1960s. One of the demands of that 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, was to increase the minimum wage. And you have written about why that was especially important for Black families and actually was a measure intended to address racial injustice.
Yes, exactly. When the federal minimum wage was first introduced, it actually didn't cover all sectors of the economy, including services and retail, which were important sectors for Black workers and especially Black workers in the South. So when the coverage of the law extended to those groups of workers, it had as big an impact on racial inequality as civil rights legislation.
Really interesting. I mean, based on your research, where does the earnings divide stand right now between white workers and their Black and Hispanic neighbors? Have recent state and local increases started to close the gap?
So earnings gaps are still substantial. As of 2024, the weekly earnings gap at the median between Hispanic and white workers was about 24%, and for Black and white workers, 19%. So these are very sizable gaps. It is true that we've seen some improvements in the gaps in recent years, primarily due to competition in the economy and tighter labor markets. But if we look back over the past 10 to 15 years, once states took the initiative on increasing their minimum wages, that has definitely also helped reduce the gap between these groups of workers.
You know, in some cases, I know the politics can be sticky, but we've seen voters weigh in directly on raising the minimum wage, including ballot measures in places like Alaska and Missouri. When those measures go before the public, how do they tend to perform? What does the data tell us about how Americans feel about actually raising the minimum wage?
So first of all, raising the minimum wage, including the federal minimum wage, is an incredibly popular policy for Americans. Polling data suggests that, well over a majority of Americans support raising the minimum. Over half support raising the minimum to $15 an hour. Over 70% support raising the federal minimum overall. And at the state level, even in Republican-leaning states, these types of ballot initiatives tend to pass with majority of support.
So now, what I remember most from the pandemic was a lot of these minimum wage jobs were deemed essential during the pandemic. Grocery store workers, home health aides, cleaners, people who help other people to do their job. What does the research show us about how boosting the minimum wage affects overall employment and the overall economy?
So if you were to take the lessons from classic, economic theory, you might be concerned about raising the minimum and having that cause significant job loss in the economy. But the past 30 years of empirical research in economics on the effects of minimum wages on jobs have shown that the employment effects are actually quite small, oftentimes, minimal, and in some cases can even be positive. And that's because one thing that raising the minimum does is it makes those types of very difficult jobs more appealing for workers, increases retention, and because there's such churn in this part of the labor market, raising the wage can actually keep workers longer on those jobs and save some costs for employers.
As an economist, does it make sense to, once the minimum has been raised, to index it to inflation so that you're not having a political fight over it every 5 or 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, this is greatly preferable, not only so that workers know that their wages are going to keep pace with the cost of living, but also so that employers know what types of increases to anticipate and expect as they're making their plans over several years ahead. Mandated minimum wage increases are sometimes necessary when there hasn't been such a policy, but it's typically easier both for workers and employers if the increases are known and scheduled ahead of time.
Okay, great discussion, very helpful. Thanks very much, Professor.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.